so happen to be my brother-in-law.
Thank you, Eric, and all of my friends out there. There's a long list. I want to thank God for bringing us here safe and pray that we return home safely. And greeting to all the wonderful organizers and the union brothers and sisters and friends of justice and peace everywhere. We give thanks to the many ancestors upon whose shoulders we stand today for all of our accomplishments, our victories, and for the strength and guidance to move ahead with courage in the many battles on every front imaginable that we confront at this very moment. And you know, there's so much hatred in the country right now as we hear the political campaigns of the Trump rhetoric and people like that. And I was fortunate to hear Dick Gregory comment on this hatred. He said if many white people had known that President Obama would become president, he said they would have left us in Africa and they would pick the cotton themselves. I speak on behalf of myself and my wife, Reverend Sandra Simmons, in the picture here, who was then the mover and shaker at our Black Community Museum called the Hush House, located on the Old West Side on Wabash, where we've been doing social justice work for at least 10 years, consciously, and on our own doing social justice and peace work and work of faith for most of our lives. Presently, my wife is in Belize, Central America, doing work with poor women, rural women who are working through a church called the Dangriga Baptist Church. And they're dealing with some personal issues, family problems. They're dealing with issues such as rape and very brutality in the families, which is seldom reported. And because they're so beaten down, they take it, they personalize it, and they don't want to, share that information and that struggle with other people. So my wife is coordinating women's groups so that they will bring these issues to the forefront and see how they can work with each other to empower one another. And so she's been doing that over the past couple of years in Belize off and on. And then when she comes back to Detroit, we work on these types of issues and strengthening the family and strengthening our communities wherever we are. We've done this in Ghana, West Africa, in Senegal, West Africa, and here in Detroit, and also in Riceboro down in Georgia. Now you know about all the very beautiful ads that you see about Dangriga about Belize. And those are true. It is a very beautiful place. It's warm all year round. Most places you go, you're near the ocean. You see all the wonders of nature in a very small place, and it's relatively cheap for retirees, I tell you, to live in the Caribbean. On the other hand, you see a lot of injustice. You see a lot of degradation of labor. You see very few situations where people are in organized labor. You see mostly privatization. You see people with no benefits. There's no public schools. So people have to pay to go to school, and they're poor people. They have to pay for health care. Now, this is true in most of the countries in Africa and Asia and South America right now. And that is true because of the long history of exploitation and colonialism that they have experienced over the past 4 centuries, which has made the Western countries very rich, including Western Europe, in North America, and on the other hand has made the people of this area, which we call the Global South, has made them and kept them very poor. Now, in order to implement this exchange, this unfair exchange where they are poor and we are rich, it requires militarism. And so the Western countries have been using militarism to implement and to dominate. And so now the chickens are coming home to roost. You see places such as the Middle East where we've had continuous warfare, where the inspiration for the warfare generally is about oil. So it's peace, it's gold and diamonds and oil, which has motivated this international policy of the West, including the United States. And so it's people like us in this room, on the other hand, who have to change this dynamic. We are taught that foreign affairs has to be something that only experts deal with. You see, people who are trained in that. But usually they also have some skin in the game, which is some money. And they want to get some money out of the outcome. So they're not looking for peace. They're looking for gain, monetary gain or some investments or something that they can, bank on. This is the Wall Street motive. And so it's going to take the little people, trade union folks, the rank and file, to come together and think about what needs to be done for peace. Now, this happened during the Vietnam War, if you recall. It was the grassroots people, the students, the churches, trade unions, that forced the government to get out of Vietnam. It wasn't done from the top down, it was done from the bottom up. And so we have to change United States foreign policy to make it become a country of truly peace, not just peace in rhetoric or justice in rhetoric, but actual peace and justice that is conducted by the little folks using the weapons of honesty, of truth, of sincerity. These are the skills that we need. My grandparents were, in fact, both of our grandparents, my wife's as well as mine, inspired us both in the family development. My wife's family always talks about her grandmother as the person who kept the family together for generations. And so many grandparents are doing that now. In fact, more and more grandparents today are taking care of at least two generations because of the economic crisis that we've been in. And so my grandparents, on the other hand, were social justice activists and labor activists. My grandfather, Johnny Wright, was active in the UAW at the beginning. And he was one of the rank and file who was a very proud union person. And he organized, participated in the organization of the establishment of the union. And he bragged about that throughout his life. And I learned about unionism just by going around with my grandfather and hearing the men of that era discuss the struggles that they had. The battles of the strikes and how they had to fight with the company goons. I used to hear that all the time. And so that gave me a union consciousness. And so, and on the other hand, my grandmother, Annie Wright, was active with the Baptist Women's Auxiliary. And they were social workers at the community level. And they weren't college educated. But they had the heart for helping people in the community. And together, they would conduct conflict resolution solutions right there in the neighborhood. And when people would call with problems in the family, where there would be violence in the family, we would go in the middle of the night. My sister and I would get on the couch and go to sleep. My grandparents would go off in the room. My grandfather with the man, and my grandmother with the woman, and they would talk for hours. And when we left, there would be peace in the house. Now, they didn't have to call the police. And this was something that we did frequently. And there were other people who were doing the same thing. Now, this was happening in the 1940s. And they had been doing it since the 30s. But it's something that we need to think about right now. And as you talk in your groups, your committees, we need to think about how do we take conflict resolution into the homes of people in our neighborhoods. So those were the people who began to inspire me, were the grandparents and the people in the churches. I was, because my grandmother also taught Negro history at King Solomon Baptist Church, and she loved poetry. And so she would have me to learn these poets, such as Paul Laurence Dunbar and the old African-American poets from the 1800s and the early 1900s. And they were discussing the conditions of World War I and World War II among the black soldiers. And I remember today, and I was a little fellow, I was so small they had to actually stand me up on the table to recite these poems. And during World War II, I can remember seeing the soldiers actually in the audience, this community groups, as I would discuss the truth of what they were experiencing at that time. Some of the black soldiers would be guarding the Nazis as prisoners of war when they came through the United States to go to the military bases. And the black soldiers had to go in the back door when they went stopped to go to restaurants, while the white Nazi prisoners could go in the front door. So this is some American history. It's not just black history. This is American history that we need to be aware of, and think that we can never turn back, as they want us to go backwards now. But we can't turn back. And I'm glad to see that all of you are here organizing and strategizing so that we can continue to move forward. And I'm inspired by that. Now, I met one of the honorees of this program, Dr. Ahmad Rahman, who was a professor at UHURU in the chair of the Black Studies Department. I don't know if you know of his history, but he had been framed up as a Black Panther back in the 60s and went to jail for about 20 years. While he was in prison, he studied, thanks to other professors here, Gloria House, who was a SNCC activist, and some of them actually taught in the prisons at that time. And Dr. Ahmad later became, he got all of his degrees, 2 degrees in prison. Then he got his PhD after he got out of prison. And he became one of the leaders in academia here at the University of Michigan and throughout the country. So we traveled together in Ghana 6 years ago, after he had written a book called The Regime Change of Kwame Nkrumah. And I'm sure many of you haven't heard of Kwame Nkrumah. He was the president of Ghana, which was one of the first African countries to become independent from colonialism in 1957. And his life is something that you must study, because he was a champion of unity, of unifying the various African countries and the people throughout the diaspora all around the world. And he was overthrown by the CIA and British intelligence. And the book also discusses many of the other African leaders and the struggles that they experienced since World War II. And when you read these accounts of what they experienced, you will see your picture in there. Because the same people who are privatizing the schools, same people who are breaking the contracts, same people who are stealing the libraries, the same people who are poisoning Flint, the same people who are cutting off the water here, they're doing the same thing there and here. It's the same folks. So when you hear about international affairs, it's really no difference, except it's in a different address. But the conditions are the same. The tricks, the low-down character of their activities, it's all the same. So it's not over your head, but the people who run all of this foreign policy, they use bigger words to describe the rape and pillage and theft and burglary. But it's the same stuff. So don't be fooled and think that that's something that's over your head, that's something that's different. It's all the same. We in the West created ISIS, Al-Qaeda. We created those we financed them and trained them, you see, and sicked them like dogs on these other people. And it worked for a while, but now they're coming back on us. But we started it. And so there is no military solution to this problem. The solution is being honest and fair and sincere and having integrity in dealing with people. That's the solution. You see, it's not sending bombs and missiles and all of that stuff that costs $1 trillion a year. That's not the solution. Now, that is the solution for Wall Street because it keeps them rich. That's their welfare system. see. And so we have to turn that around. Another one of the things we witnessed in Ghana on that trip was the slave castles. And you've seen these on television, in the documentaries, where place where when the African families were captured, they forced marched them across hundreds of miles to the coast and had these buildings erected. They were military fortresses because the various European countries were competing with each other over who was going to get the slave. Inside these buildings, it is so horrible. I mean, there aren't any words to describe what you feel, because you just have to sit down and weep, you see, when you feel it, because you actually, even though it's been cleaned up and cleaned up and cleaned up, you can still smell the horror. You can feel it in your spirit. And you think this is what your ancestors experienced, your grandparents, your great-great-grandparents experienced in this place. Now, the people who resisted got put into additional dungeons inside the dungeon. And so they were treated in ways that Hitler wouldn't even understand. So in fact, that's where, now Germany was doing this type of thing long before Hitler was even born. You see, so that didn't the only difference between what Hitler did and what the other colonial powers did, and why the U.S. and other Western countries were mad at Hitler, he was doing this to white people, in addition to doing it to people, to the dark races. The other folks generally wouldn't do that type of oppression on white folks, but Hitler went beyond the norm of decency by their standards. But in the place where the dungeon is, it's a torture chamber, and it actually says, a sign on the outside that says torture. It's for the people who were fighting back. You could hear the screaming from the torture upstairs, over the torture chamber. Now, what was upstairs? A Christian church, where the slave masters, the ship owners, and all the people involved in running the slave trade, they went there to sit down and pray and worship God. At the same time, they were listening to the howls and screams of the people in overwhelming misery. And you have to ask, what type of people are these we're dealing with? What type of immorality are we dealing with? And I thought of that in connection when I saw Governor Snyder reaction about the poisoning of the people in Flint.
Tell the truth.
What's the problem? What's the problem? I didn't know it. I mean, they just lie straight up.